abandoned after service, a wounded veteran living out of his truck discovered what no one was supposed to find: a sealed military underground airport hiding $275 million in untraceable assets. And the moment he opened that vault, powerful men who thought their secrets were buried forever started hunting him. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning sun crept over the Montana mountains like it was afraid to disturb the silence. Frost clung to the windows of the rusted 1997 Ford F-150 parked behind the abandoned grain elevator, and inside, a man stirred beneath a pile of military-issue blankets that had seen better decades. Marcus Cole opened his eyes slowly, the way a man does when he's not sure waking up is worth the effort. His breath came out in white puffs that hung in the frozen air of the truck cab. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees overnight, and his bones ached with a familiar fire that no amount of ibuprofen could touch. He was 34 years old, but his body felt 60. The limp in his right leg had become so permanent, he'd forgotten what walking straight felt like. The shrapnel they couldn't remove from his lower back sent lightning bolts of pain down his spine every time the weather changed. And the nightmares, well, those came whether he was asleep or awake, triggered by sounds that most people never noticed. A car backfiring, a door slamming, the whistle of wind through a crack in the window. Marcus sat up slowly, groaning as his spine protested. He rubbed his hands together for warmth and looked around the cab of his truck. Everything he owned in the world was here: a duffel bag of clothes, a box of canned food, a jug of water, his discharge papers in a manila envelope, and his grandfather's pocket watch sitting on the dashboard, its gold face catching the pale morning light. He'd been living like this for 11 months now. 11 months since his cousin's wife said she couldn't handle his episodes anymore. 11 months since the Veterans Administration lost his paperwork for the 4th time. 11 months since he realized that the country he'd given everything for had quietly decided he was no longer their problem. Marcus reached for the water jug and took a long drink, the cold liquid shocking his system awake. He cranked the engine, letting it idle to generate some heat, and watched the condensation on the windshield slowly clear. Through the glass he could see the small town of Bitter Ridge, Montana, population 843, beginning its morning routine. Pickup trucks rolled down Main Street. The diner's lights flickered on. Somewhere, a dog barked. He'd drifted into this town 3 weeks ago, following rumors of day labor at a ranch outside of town. The work had lasted 6 days before the ranch owner's son took over and decided he didn't need a crippled stranger handling his horses. Marcus had collected his $230 in cash and retreated to the grain elevator, where no one bothered him and no one asked questions. Today, he needed gas. His tank was below a quarter, and the last thing he could afford was to be stranded in the middle of Montana winter with no way to run the heater. He counted the bills in his wallet. $47. Enough for gas and maybe a cup of coffee if he stretched it. He put the truck in gear and pulled out from behind the elevator, the old Ford groaning like it shared his pain. The main street of Bitter Ridge was quiet, just a handful of early risers making their way to the feed store or the post office. Marcus pulled into the gas station and began pumping, watching the numbers climb with the kind of anxiety that only the truly broke understand. That's when he saw the bulletin board. It was one of those old corkboards mounted outside the station's entrance, covered with faded flyers for tractor sales, missing cats, and church bake sales. But one notice caught his eye, printed on bright yellow paper that hadn't yet faded in the sun. Foreclosure auction, it read. 200 acres with decommissioned military structures. Back taxes owed, $2,387.14. Sealed bid auction, Friday, December 15th, 10 a.m., Cascade County Courthouse. Marcus stared at the flyer for a long moment. 200 acres was a lot of land. Decommissioned military structures could mean anything from a radio tower to a bunker, and $2,387 was an impossibly low price for property in Montana, even worthless property. He pulled the flyer from the board and stuffed it in his jacket pocket. Probably nothing. Probably a contaminated site or a legal nightmare waiting to happen. But something about the words military structures stuck in his brain like a splinter. Inside the gas station, he paid for his fuel and asked the attendant, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, about the property. "Oh, that old place," she said, shaking her head. "Been sitting out there since before I moved here. Government land, they say. Something from the Cold War, sealed up tight since the 80s. She leaned in conspiratorially. "Folks around here say it's haunted or cursed. Take your pick." "Anyone bid on it before?" She laughed. "Honey, no one around here has that kind of money to throw away on ghost stories. Besides, even if you bought it, what would you do with it? Can't farm it. Can't build on it without permits the county won't give. It's just 200 acres of nothing." Marcus nodded and thanked her, but as he walked back to his truck, he found himself pulling the flyer out again. 200 acres of nothing. That sounded about right for where his life had ended up. Maybe nothing was exactly what he needed. The Cascade County Courthouse was a 3-story brick building that had seen better days, much like everything else in this part of Montana. Marcus arrived 20 minutes early on Friday morning, having driven the 47 miles from Bitter Ridge on a tank of gas he couldn't really afford to spend. The auction was held in a small conference room on the 2nd floor, and when Marcus walked in, he was surprised to find only 3 other people present: a bored-looking county clerk, an elderly man in a rancher's hat who appeared to be sleeping, and a woman in a business suit who was typing furiously on her laptop. "Here for the auction?" the clerk asked without looking up. "Yes, sir." "Sign in. Bidding starts in 10 minutes. Marcus signed his name on the sheet and took a seat in the back row. His leg throbbed from the stairs, and he stretched it out in the aisle, trying to find a position that didn't send fire up his spine. The woman in the suit glanced at him once, then returned to her laptop. The old rancher continued to snore softly. At exactly 10 a.m., the clerk stood and cleared his throat. "We have 3 properties up for auction today due to delinquent taxes. First up, Lot 47-19, 200 acres in the northeast sector, formerly designated as federal land, transferred to county jurisdiction in 2002, following decommissioning of military assets. Current taxes owed, $2,387.14. Bidding starts at $1,000. Do I hear 1,000? The woman in the suit raised her hand. 1,000. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. He hadn't expected competition. 1,000 to the lady in front. Do I hear 1,200? The old rancher jolted awake and looked around confused, then settled back into his nap. Marcus raised his hand. 1,500. The woman turned and looked at him, really looked at him this time, taking in his worn jacket, his unshaven face, his military-issue boots. Something flickered in her eyes, calculation maybe, or curiosity. 2,000, she said. Marcus swallowed hard. 2,000 was more than he had. He'd counted his savings that morning, $1,823, every cent he'd scraped together from odd jobs and aluminum can collecting over the past year. If he bid higher, he'd have to find the difference somewhere. His grandfather's watch. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. The watch had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had worn it through World War II. His father had worn it every day until he died. Marcus had carried it with him through 2 tours in Afghanistan, had clutched it during the helicopter ride after the IED explosion, had held it during the long nights in the VA hospital when the pain was so bad he wanted to scream. But what was he saving it for? To be buried with? To pawn eventually when things got even more desperate? At least this way, it would buy him something real, something solid. 200 acres of nothing was still 200 acres more than he had now. 2,400, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. The woman turned again, her eyes narrowing. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she shook her head and returned to her laptop. 2,400 to the gentleman in back. Do I hear 2,600? The clerk looked around the room. 2,400 going once, going twice. He brought down his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in back for $2,400. Marcus let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. After the paperwork was signed and the deed transferred, Marcus sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot, staring at the documents in his hands. He was now the legal owner of 200 acres of supposedly worthless Montana land. The county clerk had taken his $1,823 in cash and agreed to let him pay the remaining $577 within 30 days, a kindness Marcus hadn't expected. He would need to sell the watch. There was a pawn shop in the next town over that he'd passed on his way here, but first he wanted to see what he'd bought. The drive to the property took 45 minutes on roads that grew progressively worse the farther he traveled from civilization. The last 10 miles were on an unpaved track that made his truck bounce and groan, sending jolts of pain through his injured back with every pothole. Finally, he reached a rusted gate marked with a faded sign, U.S. government property, no trespassing. Marcus got out of his truck, bolt cutters in hand, and severed the ancient padlock. The gate swung open with a screech that echoed across the empty landscape. He drove through and followed the overgrown road another half-mile until he reached what remained of the surface structures. It wasn't much to look at. A collapsed hangar, its metal roof caved in from decades of snow. A small concrete building that might have once been an office or guard station. A chain-link fence surrounding the perimeter, more rust than metal at this point. Beyond the structures, the land stretched out in rolling hills of brown grass and scattered pine trees, beautiful in a desolate way. Marcus parked his truck and got out, his boots crunching on frozen ground. The cold wind cut through his jacket, but he barely noticed. He was too busy looking, assessing, cataloguing, the same way he'd been trained to evaluate terrain in hostile territory. The hangar was a total loss, nothing salvageable there, but the concrete building was intact, its walls solid, its roof still holding. He approached it carefully, years of military training making him cautious, even though there was obviously no threat here. The door was locked, but the lock was so corroded that a firm kick broke it free. Inside, the building was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and decay. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. An old desk, its wooden surface warped and rotting. Metal filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open and empty. A calendar on the wall, frozen in time. November 1987. He searched the building methodically, but found nothing of value. Whatever this place had been, it had been stripped clean decades ago. He was about to leave when his flashlight caught something on the floor near the back wall. Scuff marks in the dust, leading to what appeared to be a solid concrete wall. Marcus crouched down, ignoring the protest from his bad leg, and examined the marks more closely. Someone had been here recently, maybe within the last few years. The dust patterns were wrong, disturbed in a way that suggested repeated traffic to this particular spot. He ran his hands along the wall, feeling for anything unusual. The concrete was cold and rough beneath his fingers, seemingly solid. But then his fingertips found a seam, barely perceptible, a hairline crack that ran from floor to ceiling in a perfectly straight line. His heart began to beat faster. Marcus pulled out his pocket knife and traced the seam, finding its edges. It was a door, had to be, a hidden door built to look like a wall. He searched for a mechanism, a handle, anything that might trigger it to open, but found nothing. The seam simply existed, mocking him with its secrets. He stepped back and considered his options. He could try to force it open, but that would likely damage whatever mechanism controlled it. He could search for a key or a control panel somewhere else in the building, or he could come back with proper tools and approach this systematically. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something other than pain and despair. He felt curiosity. He felt purpose. Something was behind that wall, something important enough to hide, and he was going to find out what it was. He made camp that night in his truck, parked inside the fence line of his new property. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees, and he ran the engine periodically to keep from freezing, burning through gas he couldn't afford. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to that hidden door, that perfect seam in the concrete, the scuff marks that proved someone had known about it. The next morning, Marcus drove back to Bitter Ridge and found the pawn shop. The owner, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, examined the pocket watch for a long time before making an offer. $800. Marcus knew it was worth more, probably 3 or 4 times more to the right collector. But he didn't have time to find the right collector. He didn't have the luxury of patience. 1,000, he counted. 850. 900, and I walk out with cash right now. The pawn shop owner studied him for a moment, then nodded. Deal. Marcus watched as his grandfather's watch disappeared into the back room, and something in his chest cracked, just a little. But he reminded himself why he was doing this. He had land now. He had a purpose, and he had a mystery to solve. With the $900 in his pocket, he paid off his debt at the county courthouse, bought enough food and supplies to last 2 weeks, filled his gas tank, and purchased a set of tools from the hardware store, a pry bar, a sledgehammer, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a portable generator he found used for $120. By late afternoon, he was back at the property, ready to work. The concrete building was even colder than before, but Marcus barely noticed. He set up the generator outside, ran an extension cord through the door, and plugged in a work light that flooded the interior with harsh white illumination. Then he approached the hidden door with his pry bar. For 3 hours he worked at the seam, trying to find a weak point, a gap he could exploit. The concrete was old but solid, and whatever mechanism controlled the door was well hidden. His back screamed in agony, his hands grew raw and blistered. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. Finally, just as he was about to give up for the night, his pry bar slipped into a gap near the floor. He felt something give, heard a soft click, and suddenly the seam widened by a fraction of an inch. Marcus dropped to his knees and examined the gap. There was a mechanism here, some kind of release catch hidden in the floor. He worked at it with his fingers, ignoring the pain, until finally something shifted, and the entire wall section swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges. Cold air rushed out of the darkness beyond, carrying with it the smell of machine oil and something else, something electric and strange. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stepped through the opening. He found himself at the top of a stairwell, concrete steps descending into absolute blackness. The walls were reinforced with steel beams, the construction far more robust than the simple building above. This wasn't a cellar or a storage room. This was something else entirely. Marcus descended slowly, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. 20 steps, 40 steps, 60 steps. The air grew warmer as he went deeper, and he realized there must be some kind of climate control system still functioning after all these years. At the bottom of the stairs, he found another door, this one made of solid steel, military grade, with a wheel handle like something from a submarine. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. In Afghanistan, he'd entered hundreds of unknown buildings, cleared countless rooms, never knowing what waited on the other side. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of something that couldn't be taken back. He turned the wheel. The lock disengaged with a heavy clunk, and he pushed the door open. What he saw on the other side stole his breath completely. The flashlight beam seemed to go on forever, swallowed by a darkness so vast it defied comprehension. But what the light did reveal was enough to make Marcus question his own sanity. He was standing in an underground hangar carved directly into the bedrock of the Montana mountains. The ceiling soared at least 60 feet above his head, supported by massive steel beams, and parked in neat rows on the polished concrete floor were aircraft. Not just any aircraft, sleek, black, angular shapes that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Marcus had spent enough time around military hardware to recognize cutting-edge design when he saw it, and these machines were decades ahead of anything he'd ever encountered. They sat in perfect formation, 6 of them in total, their surfaces absorbing light rather than reflecting it, their wings swept back at aggressive angles. He walked among them in a daze, his flashlight playing across their surfaces. There were no visible markings, no identification numbers, no insignia of any kind. The canopies were sealed, but through the tinted glass he could see cockpit interiors that looked more like something from the space shuttle than a conventional aircraft. At the far end of the hangar, he found a set of massive doors built into the rock face, clearly designed to open onto some kind of runway. But where would a runway lead from this deep underground? The logistics were impossible, unless the runway extended through the mountain itself, emerging somewhere miles away where no one would think to look. Marcus continued exploring, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Beyond the main hangar, he found a series of smaller chambers, a machine shop with tools still organized on pegboards, a parts warehouse with sealed crates stacked to the ceiling, a fuel depot with drums that still showed full on their gauges, living quarters with bunks still made, and personal effects still sitting on nightstands. It was like everyone had simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. In what appeared to be a command center, he found the first real answers. Computer terminals sat dark and silent, but the filing cabinets were full of documents. Marcus pulled out a folder at random and began to read, his flashlight balanced on his shoulder. Project Nightfall, the header read, classification beyond top secret, eyes only. The documents were dense with technical jargon, but the basic story emerged clearly enough. This facility had been constructed in the late 1960s as part of a highly classified program to develop next-generation stealth aircraft. The technology they'd created was so advanced, so far beyond anything the public knew existed, that the government had decided to keep it hidden even from most of the military establishment. For nearly 2 decades, the program had operated in complete secrecy, developing and testing aircraft that could evade any radar system in the world. But in 1987, something had changed. Marcus found a memo dated November 3rd of that year, marked urgent in red ink. Effective immediately, all Project Nightfall operations are to cease. Personnel are to evacuate within 12 hours. No equipment, documents, or materials are to be removed from the facility. The site is to be sealed pending further review. There was no explanation for the sudden shutdown, no indication of what had prompted such drastic action. Just orders to abandon everything and leave. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the command center chairs, his mind reeling. He had stumbled onto something that wasn't supposed to exist, a secret that had been buried for nearly 40 years. These aircraft, this facility, all of it had been forgotten, left to sit in darkness while the world above moved on without ever knowing what lay beneath. But that wasn't all. As he continued searching through the command center, he found a door he hadn't noticed before, heavy steel secured with a combination lock. The lock was old, the kind that used physical tumblers rather than electronics. Marcus studied it for a moment, then pulled out his pry bar. It took him 20 minutes to break through, his shoulders aching, his hands bleeding, but finally the lock gave way and the door swung open. The room beyond was smaller than the others, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet, and it was filled floor to ceiling with metal cases. Marcus approached the nearest one and unlatched it with trembling fingers. The lid swung up, and he found himself staring at rows of gold bars, each one stamped with a serial number and the seal of the United States Treasury. He opened another case. Bearer bonds, stacks of them, issued by banks in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Another case. Uncut diamonds, hundreds of them, glittering in his flashlight beam like frozen fire. Another. Bundles of currency, American dollars, British pounds, German marks, Japanese yen, all in pristine condition. Marcus staggered backward, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. There had to be millions here, tens of millions, maybe more. He couldn't begin to estimate the value of what he was looking at. On a desk in the corner of the room, he found a leather-bound ledger. With shaking hands, he opened it and began to read. Project Nightfall Asset Inventory, the first page declared. Operational Contingency Fund. Total verified value as of October 15, 1987. $275 million. Marcus dropped the ledger. $275 million. He was standing in a room containing $275 million in untraceable assets, hidden underground for nearly 4 decades, owned now by a homeless veteran who had paid $2,400 for the land above it. He sank to his knees, overwhelmed, his breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of hallucination, some cruel trick his damaged mind was playing on him. He'd finally snapped, finally lost his grip on reality completely. But the cold metal of the gold bars was real. The rustle of the currency was real. The weight of the diamonds in his palm when he picked up a handful was undeniably, impossibly real. Marcus didn't know how long he sat there, surrounded by a fortune beyond imagination. Time seemed to lose meaning in the darkness of that underground vault. But eventually, his training took over, the same training that had kept him alive through 2 tours in a war zone. He needed to secure the site. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. And he needed to figure out what happened next. With methodical precision, he searched the rest of the room. Behind the cases of treasure, he found a small safe built into the wall. The door was ajar, as if someone had left in too much of a hurry to close it properly. Inside, he found a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Marcus opened it with trembling hands and began to read. The handwriting was neat and precise, the words carefully chosen. "My name is Colonel Raymond Price. I served as commanding officer of this facility from 1979 until the day we were ordered to abandon it. If you're reading this letter, then you've discovered what I spent the last days of my career trying to protect. The money in this vault was never meant to exist. It was assembled over 2 decades through channels that cannot be traced, using methods that would never withstand public scrutiny. Its purpose was to fund operations that Congress would never approve, wars that would never be declared, actions that our nation's leaders deemed necessary but could never acknowledge. I followed orders my entire career. I believed in the chain of command, believed that the men above me knew what was best for our country. But in November of 1987, I received orders that I could not follow. They wanted me to move the money. They wanted me to transfer it to private accounts controlled by men who had no allegiance to any nation. Men who would use it for purposes that had nothing to do with protecting America. When I refused, they threatened my family. When I still refused, they ordered the facility shut down and sealed, believing they could retrieve the assets later when attention had died down. I was supposed to destroy this letter. I was supposed to take the combination to the vault to my grave. Instead, I left the vault door accessible, hoping that someday someone would find what we hid here, someone who might do what I could not. I don't know who you are. I don't know what brought you to this place, but I know this. The men who created this fund are still out there. They've waited 40 years to recover what's in this vault. They've never forgotten and they'll never stop looking. Be careful. Trust no one. And if you're brave enough, find a way to bring the truth into the light. Colonel Raymond Price. November 7th, 1987. Marcus read the letter 3 times before setting it down. His hands had stopped shaking. His breathing had steadied. The overwhelming shock of discovery had transformed into something else, something colder and more focused. He understood now why the property had sat untouched for so long. Why no one had bid on it at the auction. Why the woman in the business suit had backed off so quickly when he raised his offer. Someone, somewhere, had been keeping this land in limbo, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was hidden beneath it. And now Marcus Cole, homeless veteran, forgotten soldier, invisible man, had walked right into the middle of something that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep buried. He should have been afraid. Maybe he was, somewhere beneath the numbness. But stronger than fear was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For so long his life had been about mere survival, scraping by one day at a time, waiting for the end without really caring when it came. But now he had something to protect, something to fight for, something that mattered. Marcus gathered the letter and the ledger and made his way back through the facility, turning off his work lights, sealing the doors behind him. By the time he emerged into the cold Montana night, his mind was already working on the problems ahead. He needed to secure the entrance. He needed supplies for a longer stay. He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with and who might come looking for it. And he needed to do all of this without attracting attention, without giving anyone reason to suspect that the worthless land they'd ignored for 40 years had finally yielded its secrets. He climbed into his truck and sat for a moment, staring out at the stars above the Montana mountains. Somewhere out there, men with power and money and no conscience were waiting. They'd been waiting for decades, and they had no idea that their carefully buried secret had just been found by a wounded veteran with nothing left to lose. Marcus started the engine and began to drive. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet. But for the first time since that IED explosion in Afghanistan had shattered his body and his future, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't running anymore. He was going to fight. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of discovery and disbelief. Marcus returned to the underground facility every morning before dawn and didn't emerge until well after dark, his flashlight batteries burning through faster than he could replace them. Each chamber he explored revealed new wonders, new impossibilities, new questions that multiplied faster than answers. The aircraft consumed most of his attention. He spent hours circling them, studying their angles, trying to understand the engineering principles that made them possible. His background as a combat engineer had given him a solid foundation in mechanical systems, but these machines were something else entirely. The skin of each aircraft was made from a material he couldn't identify, smooth as glass, but matte black, absorbing his flashlight beam rather than reflecting it. When he touched it, the surface was neither warm nor cold, existing at some neutral temperature that felt almost alive. He found maintenance logs in a cabinet near the machine shop, meticulously kept records dating back to 1972. The earliest entries described test flights that pushed the boundaries of what Marcus thought possible. Speeds exceeding Mach 3, altitudes above 90,000 feet, radar cross-sections so small they registered as birds rather than aircraft. These machines had been invisible to detection systems decades before stealth technology officially existed. The logs also revealed the human cost of such advanced development. 3 test pilots had died during the program, their names recorded with clinical detachment alongside notes about structural failures and design modifications. Marcus found their personal effects still stored in lockers near the living quarters. Photographs of families, letters from loved ones, dog tags that would never be returned. He left everything exactly as he found it, understanding that this place was as much a tomb as it was a treasure vault. The runway question answered itself on his 3rd day of exploration. Behind the main hangar, he discovered a tunnel that stretched into darkness, its walls reinforced with the same steel beams that supported the rest of the facility. He followed it for nearly 2 miles, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, until he reached another set of massive blast doors. These were sealed from the outside, but through a small observation window he could see moonlight filtering through what appeared to be a camouflaged exit built into the face of a distant mountain. The aircraft could take off underground, fly through the tunnel, and emerge miles away from the facility entrance. Anyone watching the surface would see nothing. The planes would simply appear in the sky, as if materializing from thin air. It was brilliant engineering, paranoid and excessive, but brilliant. Marcus documented everything he found. He filled 3 notebooks with sketches, measurements, and observations. He photographed the aircraft from every angle using a disposable camera he'd bought at the gas station in Bitter Ridge. He created detailed maps of the facility's layout, noting emergency exits, power systems, and potential vulnerabilities. If something happened to him, he wanted a record to survive. The vault remained his greatest concern. $275 million in untraceable assets represented both opportunity and danger on a scale he couldn't fully comprehend. He counted the gold bars, 487 of them, each weighing approximately 27 pounds. The bearer bonds totaled over $120 million in face value. The diamonds, which he couldn't properly assess, filled 7 cases. The currency, though some of it was decades old, remained legal tender worth tens of millions more. Colonel Price's letter haunted him. The men who created this fund are still out there. They've waited 40 years to recover what's in this vault. They've never forgotten, and they'll never stop looking. Marcus had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He understood patient enemies. He understood men who measured time in decades rather than days. And he understood that his discovery had started a clock he couldn't see ticking. On the 5th day, he made a decision. He couldn't protect this place alone, couldn't guard 200 acres of land and an underground facility while also figuring out what to do with what he'd found. He needed supplies, equipment, and most importantly, he needed to understand who might be watching. He drove into Bitter Ridge late that afternoon, parking his truck in front of the general store. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the owner, a weathered man named Hank who looked like he'd been born behind that counter, looked up from his newspaper. "Afternoon," Hank said. "You're the fella bought the old military land." Marcus froze. "How'd you know that?" Hank shrugged. "Small town, word travels. Plus, Jenny down at the courthouse mentioned it when she came in for coffee yesterday. Said some veteran paid cash for that cursed property. Figured it had to be you, seeing as you're the only new face around here." Marcus forced himself to relax. Small-town gossip was inevitable. It didn't mean anything sinister. "Just looking for some supplies," he said. "Batteries, canned food, that sort of thing." "Got plenty of both. Help yourself." As Marcus gathered his items, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced out the window twice, seeing nothing but empty street and parked trucks. Paranoia, he told himself. Just paranoia. But when he returned to his truck, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints in the frost around his vehicle. Someone had circled his truck while he was inside, examining it from every angle. The prints led away toward the alley beside the feed store and disappeared. Marcus drove back to the property faster than was safe on those roads, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It could have been nothing. Could have been a curious local checking out the stranger's vehicle. But every instinct he'd developed in combat zones screamed otherwise. That night, he didn't sleep in the concrete building above ground. Instead, he descended into the facility and sealed the doors behind him, making camp in the living quarters that had once housed Project Nightfall personnel. The bunks were dusty but intact, the mattresses still serviceable. More importantly, he was behind 6 inches of steel and 60 feet of solid rock. Anyone who came looking wouldn't find him easily. The next morning brought confirmation of his fears. He emerged from the facility at dawn, climbing the stairs carefully, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The concrete building appeared undisturbed, but when he stepped outside, he saw it immediately. Tire tracks, fresh ones, circling the perimeter of the collapsed hangar. Someone had driven out here during the night, surveyed the property, and left without attempting to make contact. Marcus photographed the tracks before the morning sun could melt the frost that preserved them. The tread pattern was distinctive, the kind of aggressive off-road tire you'd find on a government vehicle or high-end SUV, not the worn rubber of a local rancher's pickup. He spent the next 3 days fortifying his position. Using materials salvaged from the facility, he rigged a series of early warning devices around the property perimeter. Tripwires connected to empty cans, pressure plates buried beneath loose gravel, motion sensors he'd found still functional in the security station. It wasn't much, but it would give him notice if anyone approached. He also began moving essential supplies underground. Food, water, fuel for the generator, weapons he'd found in the facility's armory. The armory itself had been a surprise, a locked room containing enough firepower to equip a small army. Handguns, rifles, ammunition, even a few items Marcus didn't recognize that looked decades ahead of their time. He took what he needed and secured the rest. On the 7th day, they came openly. Marcus was checking his perimeter sensors when he heard the vehicle approaching. He moved quickly to a concealed position behind the collapsed hangar, watching through a gap in the rusted metal as a black SUV rolled up the access road and stopped in front of the gate. 2 men got out. Both wore dark suits that looked out of place against the Montana landscape. Both moved with the controlled precision of professionals. One was older, perhaps 50, with grey hair cropped short and a face that revealed nothing. The other was younger, 30s maybe, with the build of someone who spent serious time in the gym. The older man studied the property for a long moment, his eyes sweeping across the buildings, the fences, the ground itself as if reading a story written in the earth. Then he pulled out a phone and made a call, speaking too quietly for Marcus to hear. They stayed for 20 minutes, never attempting to enter, never doing anything overtly threatening, just watching, cataloguing, planning. Then they got back in the SUV and drove away. Marcus waited an hour before emerging from his hiding spot. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. They knew. Somehow they knew he'd found something. The question was how much they knew and what they planned to do about it. That evening, he sat in the underground command center, surrounded by documents he'd spent days organizing. Project Nightfall files covered the main desk, sorted by date and subject. Personnel records filled one cabinet. Financial documents, including the ledger that detailed the vault's contents, occupied another. And in the center of it all sat Colonel Price's letter, its yellowed paper seeming to glow under the work lights. Marcus read it again, focusing on the parts he'd glossed over before. They wanted me to move the money. They wanted me to transfer it to private accounts controlled by men who had no allegiance to any nation, men who would use it for purposes that had nothing to do with protecting America. Who were these men? The documents didn't name them directly, referring only to Oversight Committee and External Liaisons, but the financial records told a story of their own. The money in the vault hadn't accumulated naturally. It had been siphoned from dozens of black budget programs, skimmed from classified contracts, diverted from operations that the public would never know existed. Someone with extraordinary access and power had been building this fund for decades, hiding it in a facility that officially didn't exist, and now Marcus owned the only entrance. What happens next will turn this discovery upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the most forgotten among us carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next 3 weeks passed in a state of heightened alertness that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of his time overseas. Every sound made him reach for the pistol he now kept holstered at his side. Every vehicle that passed on the distant highway drew his attention. Every night brought dreams of faceless men in dark suits, circling closer and closer. The men in the SUV didn't return, but their presence had changed everything. Marcus no longer felt like a lucky discoverer. He felt like a target, and targets, he knew from experience, didn't stay lucky forever. He began venturing into town less frequently, spacing out his supply runs to avoid establishing a predictable pattern. When he did go to Bitter Ridge, he varied his routes and timing, never parking in the same spot twice, always watching for anyone who seemed too interested in his movements. It was during one of these trips that he first noticed Eleanor. She was standing behind the counter of the town's only motel, a 2-story building called the Mountain Rest that had probably been outdated when it was built in the 1960s. Marcus had stopped in looking for propane canisters, which the general store had been out of for a week. The motel office doubled as a small convenience store, selling everything from motor oil to microwave burritos. Eleanor was 82 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through him. She moved slowly but deliberately, the kind of measured pace that came from decades of refusing to be rushed. "You're the one living out at the old military place," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus tensed. "People keep saying that." "People talk," she agreed. "Not much else to do around here." She studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering on the way he held himself, the slight limp in his step, the alertness in his eyes. "You served." "2 tours, Afghanistan." She nodded slowly. "My Henry served. Vietnam. Came back different, like they all do." She paused. "He worked out at that facility of yours, back in the 70s. Never talked about it. Not once in 40 years of marriage. Came home one night white as a sheet. Wouldn't eat for 3 days. I never asked what he saw." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "Your husband worked at Project Nightfall?" Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "So you found it, the underground part." She said it calmly, as if confirming a suspicion she'd held for years. "Henry always said someone would, eventually. Said secrets that big don't stay buried forever." "What do you know about it?" "Not much. Henry died 8 years ago, took most of his secrets with him. But I know enough to recognize danger when I see it." She leaned forward slightly. "Those men in the black truck, the ones who came through last week, they stopped here first, asked questions about the property, about who'd bought it, about whether anyone had been poking around. I told them nothing." Marcus's throat tightened. "Why?" "Because Henry spent the last years of his life afraid. Afraid of knocks on the door, afraid of strangers in town, afraid of phone calls in the middle of the night. Whatever he saw out there, it haunted him. And I'll be damned if I help the people who put that fear in him." She straightened up. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a bed that isn't a truck seat. I've got a room in the back. No charge." Marcus started to refuse, his instinct screaming about trusting strangers. But something in Eleanor's eyes stopped him. She wasn't offering charity. She was offering alliance. "Why would you help me?" he asked. "Because Henry would have wanted me to," she said simply. "And because those men, whoever they are, they don't get to win, not again." That night, for the first time in weeks, Marcus slept in a real bed. Eleanor fed him pot roast and mashed potatoes, the first home-cooked meal he'd had since his cousin's wife kicked him out. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, the kind shared by people who understood that some wounds couldn't be healed with words. In the morning, Eleanor introduced him to others. Samuel was a Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED in Iraq 7 years ago. He ran the town's only auto shop, a struggling operation that survived mostly on stubbornness and disability checks. He was 41 years old, built like a barrel, with a laugh that seemed too big for his circumstances and prosthetics that he'd modified himself to better work the shop floor. Diana was a former army medic who'd served free tours before coming home to care for her dying mother. Now 47, she worked as a home health aide, driving 2 hours each day to check on elderly patients scattered across the county. The money was terrible, the work was exhausting, but she couldn't seem to stop helping people, even when it cost her everything. Thomas was the oldest of the group, a Vietnam veteran in his mid-70s who lived in a trailer behind the gas station where he'd worked for 30 years before they automated and let him go. He had a sharp mind hiding behind a slow drawl and had spent 20 years as an intelligence analyst before transferring to combat duty. He knew how to read people, how to read situations, and how to read the spaces between words where the real truth lived. Eleanor had gathered them without Marcus asking, sensing that he needed more than just her help. They met in the back room of the motel, 5 veterans sitting around a folding table covered in coffee cups and silence. "So," Thomas said finally, his voice like gravel, "Eleanor says you found something out at the old government land, something that's got serious people interested." Marcus considered lying, keeping the secret close, but he looked around the table at these faces, worn and scarred and still somehow unbroken, and he recognized something in them. These were his people, not by blood but by something deeper. He told them everything: the underground facility, the aircraft, the vault, the $275 million, Colonel Price's letter, the men in the black SUV, all of it laid out in the harsh light of Eleanor's back room like evidence at a trial. When he finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. Then Samuel let out a low whistle. "That's a hell of a thing," he said. "A hell of a thing." Diana leaned forward. "What do you want to do about it?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I know I can't protect it alone, and I know that whoever these people are, they're not going to just walk away. They've been waiting 40 years. They're not going to stop now." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're right about that. Men who build shadow funds like that, who operate outside any oversight for decades, they don't give up. They can't afford to." He paused. "But they also can't move openly. If they could, they'd have seized that property the moment it came up for auction. The fact that they're circling, watching, waiting, it means something." "It means they're not sure what I know," Marcus said, "or what I might do with it." "Exactly." Thomas straightened in his chair. "Which gives you leverage, but only as long as they're uncertain. The moment they decide you're a threat they can eliminate quietly, that leverage disappears." Eleanor spoke up. "Then we make sure they can't eliminate him quietly. We make sure people know. Not everything, not yet, but enough that he's not alone." Marcus looked around the table again. These people had no reason to help him. They had their own struggles, their own pain, their own battles with a country that had used them up and set them aside. But here they were, offering to stand beside him against enemies they didn't even fully understand. "Why?" he asked. "Why would any of you risk this?" Samuel laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Brother, look at us. We've got nothing left to lose. The country we served forgot about us a long time ago. At least this way, maybe we get to mean something again." Diana nodded. "We've all been fighting alone for too long. Fighting the VA, fighting the bills, fighting the nightmares. Maybe it's time we fought together." Thomas simply shrugged. "I spent 20 years in intelligence. The last thing I'm going to do is let some shadow organization win because we were too scattered to push back." And Eleanor smiled, the first real smile Marcus had seen from her. "Henry would be raising hell right now if he were here. Since he's not, I'll have to do it for him." Marcus felt something shift inside him, some frozen piece of his heart cracking open for the first time in years. He'd spent so long believing he was worthless, that his life didn't matter, that the country he'd bled for saw him as nothing but a problem to be managed. But these people, these fellow cast-offs and forgotten soldiers, they were looking at him like he mattered, like his discovery mattered, like maybe, just maybe, they could all matter together. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, but we do this smart. We fortify the site, we document everything. We figure out who these people are and what they want, and we don't make a move until we understand the full picture." Thomas grinned. Now you're thinking like an analyst. Over the next 10 days, the group transformed from strangers into a unit. They worked in shifts, never leaving Marcus alone at the property for long. Samuel brought tools and equipment from his shop, helping Marcus improve the facility's defenses. Diana established a medical station using supplies from the underground infirmary, most still sealed in their original packaging. Thomas spent hours going through the classified documents, building a timeline of Project Nightfall and identifying the key players involved. Eleanor served as their base of operations in town, monitoring the motel's guest registry and keeping track of any strangers who passed through. It was she who first noticed the pattern. 3 different people in the last week, she reported during one of their evening meetings, all asking about the property, all staying one night and leaving before dawn. They're not working together, far as I can tell, but they're all looking for the same thing. Marcus nodded grimly. They're probing, trying to figure out what I know without tipping their hand. Or they're looking for weaknesses, Thomas added, trying to find a way in that doesn't involve going through you. There isn't one, Marcus said. I've sealed every entrance except the main one, and that's rigged with enough warnings to wake the dead. Diana looked up from the medical inventory she was organizing. That won't matter if they decide to come in force. We can't fight a private army with tripwires and pistols. We won't have to, Thomas said quietly. Not if we play this right. He spread out a map he'd drawn of the regional power structure, names and connections traced in careful lines. These people, whoever they are, they've stayed hidden this long by avoiding attention. The last thing they want is publicity. If we can find a way to make seizing the property publicly visible, they'll have to back off. Or they'll just kill us all and bury the evidence, Samuel said darkly. Thomas shook his head. Too risky. We're not isolated anymore. People in town know about Marcus. People know about our little group. Bodies start piling up. Someone's going to ask questions. These people have survived by being invisible. Mass murder tends to attract attention. Marcus stared at the map, his mind working through the implications. Thomas was right. Their best protection wasn't firepower. It was visibility. As long as they remained connected to the community, as long as people knew they existed and cared about what happened to them, the shadow organization would have to move carefully. But visibility cut both ways. The more people who knew about the discovery, the greater the chance that information would reach the wrong ears. They were walking a razor's edge between protection and exposure. We need more information, Marcus said finally. We need to know exactly who we're dealing with, what resources they have, and what they're willing to do. Without that, we're just guessing. Thomas nodded. I've already started. Those documents you found include some names, mostly low-level players, but they connect to larger networks. Give me another week and I'll have a better picture. You've got it, Marcus said. In the meantime, we stay sharp, we stay together, and we don't take any chances. The meeting broke up near midnight, each member returning to their assigned posts. But as Marcus made his way back to the property under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to pulse, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The shadow organization had been patient for 40 years. They wouldn't stay patient forever. And when they finally moved, his little band of forgotten veterans would be all that stood between them and the truth that had been buried for so long. He just hoped they would be enough. The calm before the storm lasted exactly 12 days. 12 days of fortification, of planning, of watching the horizon for threats that seemed to hover just out of sight. Then, on a Tuesday morning so cold the air itself seemed to crack, everything changed. Marcus was running his usual perimeter check when he noticed the footprints. They weren't near his truck this time. They were inside the fence line, following a path that led directly to the concrete building that housed the entrance to the underground facility. Someone had been on his property during the night, had walked right up to the door of his most guarded secret, and had left without him knowing. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. His security measures, the tripwires, the motion sensors, the warning devices he'd so carefully placed, none of them had been triggered. Whoever had done this knew exactly where his defenses were and had avoided every single one. He followed the footprints with his hand on his pistol, heart pounding against his ribs. They circled the concrete building twice, paused at the door, then continued around the back to a spot where the foundation met the frozen earth. There, pressed into the frost, was the clear impression of someone kneeling, examining the ground, searching for something. They knew. Somehow, they knew there was more here than met the eye. They were looking for another entrance, another way in that didn't require going through him. Marcus spent the rest of that day reinforcing every potential vulnerability he could find. He moved supplies deeper into the facility, cached weapons at strategic points throughout the underground complex, and established multiple fallback positions in case he needed to retreat quickly. By nightfall, his hands were raw and his back screamed in agony, but he felt marginally more secure. The feeling didn't last. 3 days later, he drove into Bitter Ridge for supplies and found his truck had been searched again. This time, they'd been more thorough, more invasive. The glove compartment hung open, its contents scattered across the passenger seat. The floor mats had been pulled up, the space beneath examined. Even the spare tire in the bed had been removed and replaced, clearly checked for hidden compartments. But it was what they'd left behind that chilled him to the bone. On the driver's seat, placed with deliberate care, sat a photograph. It showed Marcus standing in front of the collapsed hangar at his property, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. On the back, written in neat block letters, were 3 words: "We are watching." Marcus drove back to the property at twice the legal speed limit, his mind racing through possibilities. They were escalating, moving from passive surveillance to active intimidation. The message was clear. We know who you are, we know where you are, and we can reach you whenever we want. He called an emergency meeting that night. The group gathered in the underground command center this time, 60 feet below the surface, surrounded by the ghosts of Project Nightfall. Eleanor had driven out despite the dangerous roads, her ancient Buick bouncing over potholes that would have discouraged anyone less determined. Samuel arrived on a modified all-terrain vehicle he'd built himself, its engine whisper-quiet thanks to modifications that probably violated several patents. Diana came in her home health aid van, still wearing scrubs from her afternoon rounds. Thomas walked as he always did, his trailer only 4 miles away and his legs still strong despite his age. Marcus showed them the photograph. The room went silent. "They're not playing anymore," Samuel said finally, his voice hard. "This is a warning shot." Thomas studied the image with analytical intensity. "Taken 3 days ago based on the shadow angles. They've had eyes on you for at least that long, probably longer." He looked up at Marcus. "What else have you noticed? Anything unusual, no matter how small?" Marcus thought back over the past weeks. "My perimeter was breached 4 nights ago. Someone walked right through my defenses without triggering anything. They knew exactly where every sensor was." Diana's face paled. "That means they've been watching long enough to map your security. Or they have someone feeding them information," Thomas finished. "Someone who's seen your setup." The implication hung heavy in the air. The only people who knew the details of Marcus's defenses were the 5 of them sitting in this room. The idea that one of them might be compromised, might be reporting to the shadow organization, was almost too terrible to consider. Eleanor broke the tension. "It's not one of us," she said firmly. "I'd stake my life on everyone here." She paused. "But I've had guests at the motel. Some of them asked questions, wanted tours of the area. I may have mentioned the property, not the details, but enough to let slip that someone was out here taking security seriously." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's probably it. They've been gathering intelligence from multiple sources, piecing together a picture. You don't need a mole when you have patient observers and loose lips. So what do we do? Diana asked. We can't just wait for them to make their move. Marcus had been thinking about this for days, running scenarios in his head, trying to find an approach that didn't end with all of them dead or disappeared. We need to understand who we're dealing with, he said. Not just shadows and suits, but actual names, actual organizations. We can't fight what we can't see. Thomas pulled out a notebook, its pages covered in his cramped handwriting. I've been working on that. The documents you found mention an oversight committee that controlled Project Nightfall's black budget. Most of the names are redacted, but there are references to external liaisons who handled the money side of things. He flipped to a marked page. One name keeps appearing in the financial records, a company called Meridian Strategic Partners. Officially, they're a consulting firm based in Virginia. Unofficially, they seem to have been the conduit for all the questionable money flowing in and out of this facility. Meridian Strategic Partners, Marcus repeated. Never heard of them. You wouldn't have. They don't advertise, but they've got connections to defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and a whole web of shell companies that would take years to untangle. Thomas paused. The interesting thing is, they're still active, still operating out of the same Virginia address after all these decades. Whatever they were doing in 1987, they never stopped. Samuel leaned forward. So these are the people coming after Marcus, this Meridian company? Probably not directly, Thomas said. Companies like that work through intermediaries, cutouts, deniable assets. The men in the black SUV, whoever left that photograph, they're hired hands. The real power is layers removed, protected by distance and bureaucracy. Eleanor spoke up. Then how do we get to them? How do we make them back off? Thomas smiled grimly. We don't, not directly, but we can make the cost of coming after Marcus higher than the benefit. We can create visibility, documentation, insurance that would make any move against him too risky to attempt. What kind of insurance? Marcus asked. The truth, Thomas said simply. We compile everything you found, every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. We create multiple copies and distribute them to people we trust, with instructions to release everything if something happens to any of us. Suddenly, eliminating us doesn't solve their problem. It makes it worse. Diana nodded slowly. Mutually assured exposure. If we go down, we take their secrets with us. Exactly. Marcus considered the plan. It was elegant in its simplicity, using the shadow organization's own need for secrecy against them. But it assumed they would behave rationally, would weigh costs and benefits and choose the logical path. In his experience, powerful people didn't always make logical choices, especially when they felt cornered. It's a start, he said, but we need more. We need to know exactly what we're holding over them, what secrets are worth killing to protect. The next 2 weeks were spent in intensive research. Thomas took the lead, his decades of intelligence experience proving invaluable as he pieced together the puzzle of Project Nightfall and its connections to the broader world. Diana and Samuel took turns maintaining security at the property, while Marcus and Eleanor gathered additional information from town records, old newspapers, and the scattered memories of longtime residents. The picture that emerged was darker than any of them had imagined. Project Nightfall hadn't just been about developing stealth aircraft. It had been a proving ground for technology that was meant to remain permanently hidden, weapons and systems that would give their controllers an insurmountable advantage in any conflict. The aircraft Marcus had found were just the visible portion of the program. Beneath them lay research into electronic warfare, psychological operations, and capabilities that the documents only hinted at in classified language. But the real secret, the one that Colonel Price had died protecting, was the money itself. $275 million in untraceable assets represented more than just a slush fund for black operations. It represented proof of systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. Evidence that powerful men had been stealing from the American people for decades to fund their private agendas. If that evidence became public, careers would end, institutions would crumble. People who had spent their lives building power and influence would find themselves facing prosecution, disgrace, prison. Small wonder they were willing to kill to keep it buried. Marcus was reviewing Thomas's latest findings when the perimeter alarm sounded. It was mid-afternoon, broad daylight, not the time he would have expected an intrusion. He grabbed his pistol and moved quickly to a window that offered a view of the access road. A single vehicle was approaching, a black Mercedes sedan that looked absurdly out of place on the rutted dirt track. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if its driver wanted to be seen. The car stopped outside the gate and sat idling for a long moment. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 60 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who was used to being obeyed, who had never in his life worried about the consequences of his actions. He stood beside the car and looked directly at the concrete building where Marcus was hiding, as if he knew exactly where to find him. Marcus considered his options. He could stay hidden, wait for the man to leave. He could call for backup, get his people here before making any moves. Or he could go out and face whatever this was directly. He chose the third option. The cold air bit at his face as he emerged from the building, pistol holstered but hand resting casually near it. He walked toward the gate with a measured stride, his limp more pronounced than usual from the cold. The man in the suit watched him approach with an expression of mild interest, like someone observing an unusual insect. "Marcus Cole," the man said when Marcus reached the gate. "I've been hoping we could have a conversation."
"You know my name. I don't know yours."
The man smiled, showing perfect teeth. "You can call me Mr. Conrad. I represent certain parties who have a historical interest in this property." "Meridian Strategic Partners," Marcus said flatly. Something flickered in Conrad's eyes, surprise quickly suppressed. "You've done your homework. Good. That makes this easier." "Makes what easier?" Conrad reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing his movements. He pulled out a slim envelope and held it up. "I'm here to make you an offer, a very generous offer considering the circumstances." Marcus didn't reach for the envelope. "I'm listening." "My clients are prepared to pay you $5 million for the property and everything on it. That includes the surface structures and any, shall we say, subsurface discoveries you may have made." He paused. $5 million, Mr. Cole, tax-free, deposited in any account you choose anywhere in the world, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. $5 million. A year ago, that number would have seemed like a fantasy, more money than he could imagine. But now, standing in front of this polished predator, he felt only disgust. "And if I say no?" Conrad's smile didn't waver. "I'd strongly advise you not to say no. You're a homeless veteran with documented PTSD and no family to speak of. No one would be surprised if you simply disappeared. No one would ask questions. No one would care." He stepped closer to the gate, close enough that Marcus could smell his cologne. $5 million buys a lot of peace of mind. Refusing it buys nothing but trouble. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I've faced trouble before, bigger trouble than you." "Have you?" Conrad's voice dropped to something almost gentle. "Have you faced the kind of trouble that can erase a person entirely, that can make it so you never existed at all? Because that's what my clients are capable of, Mr. Cole. They've been doing it for 50 years. They're very, very good at it." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind gusted across the empty landscape, carrying flakes of snow that stung Marcus's exposed skin. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily, hunting for prey. "Tell your clients something for me," Marcus said finally. "Tell them I didn't survive 2 tours in Afghanistan, didn't drag my broken body through 11 months of homelessness, didn't claw my way back from the edge of death just to hand over what I've found to men like them." He paused. "Tell them I know what's in that vault. I know where the money came from. I know whose names are on those documents. And if anything happens to me, if anything happens to any of my people, all of it goes public. Every secret, every crime, everything." Conrad's smile finally faded. "That would be a very unfortunate choice. Maybe, but it's my choice to make, not yours, not your clients, mine." They stared at each other across the rusty gate, two men from different worlds, neither willing to back down. Then Conrad nodded slowly, almost respectfully. "I'll relay your message," he said. "But I want you to understand something. This offer won't come again, and the next conversation we have won't be nearly as civil." He turned and walked back to his car, his expensive shoes crunching on the frozen gravel. "Enjoy the rest of your day, Mr. Cole. I suspect you won't have many more of them." The Mercedes pulled away, disappearing down the access road in a cloud of dust and exhaust. Marcus watched it go, his heart pounding, his hands steady. He'd just turned down $5 million and made enemies of people who had been disappearing their problems for half a century. But he'd also drawn a line. He'd declared himself, and whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. The attack came 3 nights later. Marcus was underground, reviewing documents in the command center, when his radio crackled with Diana's voice. She was on night watch at the perimeter, monitoring the sensors from a concealed position near the collapsed hangar. "Marcus, we've got movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. No headlights. They're trying to be sneaky." He was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle and heading for the stairs. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. Can't tell in the dark. They stopped about half a mile out. I think they're deploying on foot." "Fall back to Rally Point Bravo. I'm on my way." He emerged from the facility into darkness, so complete he could barely see his hand in front of his face. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from the distant glow of Bitter Ridge on the horizon. He moved by memory, navigating the familiar terrain toward the position where Diana was waiting. She met him at the edge of the tree line, her face pale but determined. "They're spreading out. Looks like a standard flanking maneuver, professionals, not amateurs." Marcus scanned the darkness, his combat instincts taking over. "Where's Samuel?" "Heading to the south perimeter. He'll hit them from behind if they try to breach the fence." "And Thomas?" "With Eleanor in town. I radioed them. They're standing by." Marcus nodded. This was what they'd prepared for, what they'd hoped would never come. A direct assault on the property. The question was what the attackers were after, the vault, the documents, or him. "We can't hold this position if they come in force," he said. "We need to fall back to the facility. Once we're underground, they'll have to come through the choke point at the entrance. We can hold them there." Diana hesitated. "What about the perimeter defenses? We just let them walk through?" "The defenses are meant to slow them down, not stop them. We don't have the firepower for a sustained fight. What we have is position and preparation." They began moving toward the concrete building, staying low, using the terrain for cover. Behind them, Marcus could hear the sounds of approaching footsteps, multiple people moving through the brush with practiced stealth. These weren't ordinary thugs. These were trained operators, military or paramilitary, sent to complete a job. They reached the building just as the first shots rang out. Bullets whined overhead, slamming into the concrete with sharp cracks. Marcus pushed Diana through the door and followed, slamming it behind them and throwing the heavy bolt home. "Go," he ordered. "Get to the command center. Seal every door behind you." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. I need to activate the secondary defenses." Diana hesitated for just a moment, then nodded and disappeared down the stairs. Marcus moved to a panel on the wall and began flipping switches, activating systems he'd hoped never to use. Throughout the facility, steel doors slammed shut, lights flickered to red. The ancient security protocols of Project Nightfall came to life after 40 years of dormancy. He was about to follow Diana when a window shattered and a canister rolled across the floor, hissing and spewing thick white smoke. Tear gas. Marcus held his breath and ran, making it to the stairs just as the gas began to fill the room. He descended 3 steps at a time, his bad legs screaming in protest, and pulled the stairwell door closed behind him. The facility was designed to be sealed against chemical and biological attacks. The moment the door closed, air filters activated, scrubbing the atmosphere clean. Marcus took a deep breath of filtered air and continued downward, his rifle ready. Diana was waiting at the command center, her own weapon drawn. "They breached the surface building," she reported. "I heard them trying the door. It'll hold for a while, but not forever." Marcus nodded. "Call the others. Tell them Plan Omega is in effect." Plan Omega was their last resort, the contingency they'd developed in case everything else failed. It would either save them or destroy everything they'd fought for. There was no middle ground. While Diana made the call, Marcus moved to the communications panel. Among the many systems left behind by Project Nightfall was a hardened radio setup designed to transmit through solid rock and reach receivers hundreds of miles away. He'd tested it a week ago, confirming it still functioned after all these years. Now he activated it and began to broadcast. "This is Marcus Cole. I am currently under armed assault at coordinates that I am transmitting with this message. I possess evidence of decades of government corruption, illegal black budget operations, and systematic theft of public funds. Copies of this evidence have been distributed to multiple secure locations with instructions for automatic release if I do not check in within the next 24 hours. Any harm to me or my associates will result in immediate and complete disclosure. This is not a bluff. Repeat, this is not a bluff." He transmitted the message 3 times, then switched the radio to receive. If anyone was listening, if any of the contacts Thomas had identified were monitoring the old Project Nightfall frequencies, they would know what was happening. And they would have to choose a side. The sounds of assault continued above them. Marcus could hear explosions, the attackers breaching doors, working their way methodically through the facility's defenses. They had the numbers, the training, and the equipment to eventually break through. It was only a matter of time. But time was exactly what Marcus needed. 20 minutes after his broadcast, the radio crackled to life. A female voice, crisp and professional, filled the command center. "Unidentified broadcaster, this is Federal Communications Monitor. Your transmission has been received and recorded. Please identify yourself and your location." Marcus felt a surge of hope. Someone had heard, someone was responding. Whether they were friend or foe remained to be seen, but at least his message had reached beyond the walls of this buried facility. "This is Marcus Cole, U.S. Army veteran, honorable discharge. I am the legal owner of the property known as the Old Whitaker Military Installation in Cascade County, Montana. I am currently under armed assault by unknown paramilitary forces. I am requesting immediate federal assistance." A long pause. Then, "Mr. Cole, please stand by. Your situation is being evaluated." The next 30 minutes were the longest of Marcus's life. Above him, the sounds of assault continued, growing closer. Diana reported that the attackers had reached the main hangar, were working on the blast doors that separated them from the deepest sections of the facility. Samuel, who had circled back through the tunnel system, confirmed at least 12 hostiles in the facility, well armed and organized. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The gunfire ceased. The explosions ended. An eerie silence fell over the facility, broken only by the hum of air filtration systems and the pounding of Marcus's heart. His radio crackled again. A different voice this time, male, authoritative. "Marcus Cole, this is Special Agent Davis, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have secured the surface and taken the assault team into custody. You are safe to emerge. I repeat, you are safe to emerge." Marcus looked at Diana. She looked back at him. Neither of them moved.
Could be a trick, she whispered.
Could be, he agreed. But we can't stay down here forever. He keyed the radio. Agent Davis, I'll need some verification before I open any doors. Can you confirm your identity through official channels? Another pause. Then, Mr. Cole, I'm going to have someone you know speak to you. Please stand by. The next voice that came through the speaker made Marcus's knees go weak. Marcus, it's Thomas. I'm up here with the feds. They're legitimate. Eleanor called them hours ago, right after Diana's warning. They've been monitoring the situation by satellite. It's over, son. It's really over. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the tension drain from his body like water from a cracked vessel. His hands shook. His legs trembled. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive this. We're coming up, he said into the radio. Don't shoot us. Thomas chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. Wouldn't dream of it. You've got too much paperwork to fill out for me to let that happen. The emergence from the facility felt like being born again. Marcus climbed the stairs with Diana beside him, both of them blinking against the sudden brightness of emergency floodlights that had been set up throughout the surface building. Federal agents in tactical gear lined the walls, their weapons pointed at the ground, their faces professionally neutral. Outside, the scene was controlled chaos. Helicopter rotors thumped in the distance, vehicles with official markings surrounded the property. And in the center of it all, hands cuffed and faces blank, knelt the assault team that had tried to breach the facility. Thomas was waiting near the entrance, his weathered face split by a grin. Eleanor stood beside him, wrapped in a heavy coat, her silver hair disheveled, but her eyes bright with triumph. Samuel rolled up moments later on his ATV, whooping like a teenager. You did it, Thomas said, clasping Marcus's hand. You crazy, stubborn fool. You actually did it. Marcus shook his head. We did it. All of us. Special Agent Davis approached, a tall man with serious eyes and an air of authority that suggested significant rank. Mr. Cole, I have a lot of questions for you. But first, I want you to know that your broadcast was received by multiple federal monitoring stations. The evidence you mentioned, if it exists, is of significant interest to ongoing investigations. It exists, Marcus said. All of it, and you'll have access to everything as soon as I have certain assurances. Davis raised an eyebrow. What kind of assurances? Marcus looked around at his little group of forgotten veterans, these people who had risked everything to stand beside him. Protection for my people, medical care, housing, the things they should have gotten from the country they served but never did. Davis considered this for a moment. Then he nodded. I think that can be arranged. Marcus let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for weeks. Around him, his friends moved closer, forming a tight circle of solidarity that no enemy had been able to break. They were battered, exhausted, and forever changed by what they'd been through. But they were together. And for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, they were seen. The weeks that followed the assault blurred together in a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, and endless cups of government-issue coffee. Marcus spent more time in federal buildings than he had in his entire military career, answering the same questions over and over from different agencies, each one hungry for their piece of the story. The FBI took point on the investigation, but they weren't alone. Representatives from the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, the IRS, and half a dozen other acronyms Marcus had never heard of all wanted access to the facility and its secrets. He cooperated with everyone, holding nothing back, understanding that his only real protection lay in complete transparency. The assault team, it turned out, had been composed of private military contractors with ties to Meridian strategic partners. Under interrogation, several of them flipped, providing detailed accounts of their recruitment, their orders, and the chain of command that led back to Virginia. Within 2 weeks, federal agents raided Meridian's headquarters, seizing computers, documents, and personnel. Mr. Conrad, the silver-haired man who had offered Marcus $5 million to walk away, was arrested at Dulles International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Singapore. He refused to cooperate with investigators, but the evidence seized from Meridian's offices spoke for him. Decades of correspondence, financial records, and operational plans laid bare a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Marcus watched the news coverage from a hotel room the FBI had arranged for him, Eleanor sitting beside him, the two of them sharing a bowl of popcorn like they were watching a movie instead of history being made. Meridian Strategic Partners indicted on 37 counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, the anchor read, her voice carefully neutral. Sources say the investigation stems from evidence discovered at an abandoned military facility in Montana, though details remain classified. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Henry would never believe this. He spent 40 years thinking no one would ever find out what happened out there. And now it's on the evening news. Marcus nodded, but his attention was elsewhere. The news coverage mentioned the facility, mentioned the indictments, but it said nothing about the vault, nothing about the $275 million still sitting in that underground room. The feds were keeping that detail under wraps, at least for now. The question of what would happen to the money consumed most of Marcus's waking thoughts. Legally, the situation was extraordinarily complicated. The assets had been accumulated through illegal means, siphoned from government budgets over decades. By rights, they should be returned to the Treasury, restored to the public funds from which they'd been stolen. But Marcus had discovered them. He had protected them, nearly died for them, and his actions had exposed a conspiracy that might have remained hidden for another 40 years. Didn't that count for something? The answer, as it turned out, was yes. 3 months after the assault, Marcus received a call from a lawyer he'd never heard of, a woman named Grace Chen, who specialized in whistleblower cases. She'd been following his situation closely and believed he had a strong claim under various federal whistleblower statutes. The money itself is forfeit, she explained during their first meeting. It was obtained illegally, and it'll eventually be absorbed back into the Treasury. But the value of the information you provided, the exposure of the conspiracy, that's a different matter. Whistleblower awards in cases like this can range from 10 to 30% of recovered assets. Marcus did the math in his head. 10% of $275 million was $27.5 million. 30% was over $80 million. Either figure was beyond anything he'd ever imagined. "What's the catch?" he asked. Grace smiled. "The catch is that these cases take years, sometimes decades. The government will fight you every step of the way, not because they don't appreciate what you did, but because that's how bureaucracy works. You'll need patience, resources, and a very good legal team. I don't have any of those things." "You have me," Grace said, "and I work on contingency. I don't get paid unless you get paid, so my interests and yours are perfectly aligned." The legal battle began in earnest. Marcus found himself traveling to Washington every few weeks, meeting with lawyers, giving testimony, reviewing endless documents. The process was exhausting, frustrating, and often felt hopeless. But he persisted, not for himself, but for the others. Thomas had been diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer 2 months after the assault. The decades of smoking had finally caught up with him, and the prognosis wasn't good. Marcus visited him in the hospital whenever he could, sitting by his bed, talking about the case, keeping him informed of every development. "You're going to win this thing," Thomas said during one of their visits, his voice weak but his eyes still sharp. "I've seen enough intelligence analyses to know when the evidence is overwhelming. They can't bury this one. There are too many people watching now." Marcus held his friend's thin hand. "When we win, there's going to be money, a lot of it. I want you to know, whatever I get, it's going to the people who deserve it. People like you, like Samuel, like Diana. People who gave everything and got nothing back." Thomas smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "That's why you're going to win, son. Because you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for us. For all of us." Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in late spring, the sun streaming through his hospital window, Eleanor holding one hand and Marcus holding the other. He went peacefully, his last words a simple expression of gratitude. "Thank you for letting me matter again." They buried him in the Veterans Cemetery outside Bitter Ridge, a small plot with a simple headstone. The funeral was attended by more people than Marcus expected. Locals who had come to know Thomas during his weekly visits to the diner, fellow veterans who had heard his story, even a few federal agents who had worked the case alongside him. Marcus spoke at the graveside, his voice steady despite the grief pressing against his chest. "Thomas spent 20 years in service to this country, and he spent the next 30 years being forgotten by it. He had every reason to be bitter, to turn away, to give up. But he didn't. When I needed help, when I was lost and outnumbered and facing enemies I couldn't see, he was there. He taught me that intelligence isn't just about gathering information. It's about understanding what that information means. And what Thomas understood, better than anyone I've ever known, was that some things are worth fighting for, not because you'll win, but because they matter." He paused, looking down at the flag-draped coffin. "Rest easy, soldier. We'll take it from here." The legal case dragged on for another 18 months. Marcus marked the passing time by the changes it brought to his little group of forgotten veterans. Samuel's auto shop had expanded, thanks to loans Marcus co-signed with the promise of future settlement funds. Diana had gone back to school, pursuing a nursing degree that would allow her to do more for her patients. Eleanor had transformed the Mountain Rest Motel into an unofficial gathering place for veterans in the region, a spot where they could find a hot meal, a warm bed, and someone who understood what they'd been through. And Marcus himself had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now. The pain in his back and leg remained, but it no longer defined him. He'd spent so long believing he was worthless, that his life had no meaning, that the country he'd served saw him as nothing but a problem to be managed. Now he knew different. He mattered, they all mattered, and he was going to make sure the world knew it. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 years and 4 months after the assault on the facility. Marcus was at the motel, helping Eleanor repair a leaky faucet in one of the guest rooms, when his phone buzzed with Grace Chen's number. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully controlled but unable to hide an undercurrent of excitement. "We have a settlement offer." He sat down on the edge of the bathtub, his heart suddenly pounding. "How much?" $43 million. The number didn't register at first. He heard it, processed the individual sounds, but his brain refused to assemble them into meaning. "Say that again." $43 million, approximately 15.6% of the recovered assets, plus additional compensation for the conspiracy exposure and personal risk you endured. The government is offering to settle rather than continue litigation. Marcus closed his eyes. $43 million. More money than he could have imagined in 1,000 lifetimes of sleeping in his truck and collecting aluminum cans. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "I recommend you take it," Grace said. "We could fight for more, but that would mean years more litigation, appeals, uncertainty. This is a bird in the hand, a very, very large bird." Marcus thought about Thomas, about the promise he'd made at his deathbed. He thought about Samuel and Diana and Eleanor. He thought about all the veterans he'd met over the past 2 years, men and women just like him, abandoned by the system, invisible to the society they'd protected. "I'll take it," he said, "on one condition." "What's that?" I want to use it right, not just for me, for all of them." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I know exactly what you mean, and I think I can help." The Nightfall Veterans Foundation was incorporated 3 months later. Marcus had worked with Grace and a team of non-profit specialists to create an organization that would do what the VA couldn't or wouldn't: actually help veterans in need. The foundation's mission was simple: housing, healthcare, job training, and mental health support for veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system. No bureaucracy, no endless paperwork, no 6-month waiting lists. Just direct assistance delivered by people who understood what it meant to serve and what it meant to be forgotten. Marcus funded the foundation with $30 million, keeping $13 million for himself and his original group. It was more than he would ever need, more than enough to ensure that Eleanor, Samuel, Diana, and the families of Thomas and Henry would be secure for life. But the real legacy wasn't the money. It was what the money built. The underground facility, with its aircraft and its secrets, was eventually transferred to the Smithsonian Institution as part of a classified historical preservation agreement. But the surface property remained in Marcus's hands, and he transformed it into something Colonel Price could never have imagined. Where the collapsed hangar once stood, Marcus built a training center, state-of-the-art workshops for automotive repair, welding, electrical work, and construction. Veterans arrived from across the country, men and women who had once slept under bridges and begged for spare change, now learning skills that would give them a future. The concrete building that had once hidden the entrance to the underground facility became an administrative center, its walls lined with photographs and stories of veterans the foundation had helped. Marcus's office occupied the same space where he'd first discovered the hidden door, a constant reminder of how far he'd come. Samuel ran the automotive program, teaching young veterans the same skills that had allowed him to rebuild his life after losing his legs. His prosthetics had been upgraded with the finest technology money could buy, and he moved through the workshop with an energy that belied his age. Diana headed the medical outreach program, a mobile clinic that traveled to remote areas where veterans had no access to health care. She'd completed her nursing degree and assembled a team of volunteers who shared her passion for helping those in need. Eleanor's motel had been expanded into a full residential facility, housing veterans in recovery while they completed training programs. She'd hired staff to help with the daily operations, but she still insisted on cooking breakfast herself every morning, claiming that no one else could make pancakes the way Henry used to like them. And Marcus, the homeless veteran who had once measured his worth in aluminum cans and sleepless nights, now measured it in lives changed. Every veteran who came through the foundation's doors represented a person saved from the fate that had nearly claimed him. Every success story was proof that the fight had been worth it. 1 year after the foundation opened, Marcus stood before a crowd of 500 at its first annual gala. The event was held in a ballroom in Washington, D.C., filled with donors, politicians, celebrities, and most importantly, veterans who had been helped by the Foundation's programs. He wore a suit for the occasion, the first suit he'd owned since his army dress uniform, though the tie still felt like a noose around his neck. The teleprompter glowed in front of him, but he'd memorized his speech so thoroughly that he barely needed it. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady, I was sleeping in my truck behind an abandoned grain elevator in Montana. I had $47 to my name, a body broken by war, and a mind haunted by things I couldn't forget. I believed with absolute certainty that my life was over, that I would die forgotten, just another veteran who slipped through the cracks of a system that didn't have room for people like me. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. I was wrong. Not because I found a fortune buried in the ground. The money, as miraculous as it seemed at the time, was just a tool. What really saved me was something much more powerful. It was people. People who looked at a broken-down soldier and saw something worth saving. People who took a chance on a stranger because they understood that sometimes the person who needs help the most is the one least able to ask for it. He thought of Eleanor, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. Of Samuel, his prosthetic legs gleaming beneath the table. Of Diana, her medical coat draped over the back of her chair. Of the empty seat beside them where Thomas should have been sitting. The Nightfall Veterans Foundation exists because no veteran should ever have to feel as alone as I did. Because the men and women who sacrifice everything for this country deserve more than neglect and indifference. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars and cents. They're measured in second chances. He lifted his glass. To everyone who has served. To everyone who has struggled. And to everyone who has found the courage to believe that broken things can still be made whole. Thank you. The room rose to its feet, applause washing over him like a wave. Marcus stood there, absorbing it, feeling something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Pride. Not in the money, not in the publicity, not in any of the external markers of success. Pride in who he had become, pride in what he had built, pride in the knowledge that his life, once so seemingly worthless, had come to mean something to others. After the gala, as the crowds dispersed and the staff began clearing tables, a young woman approached Marcus. She was perhaps 25, thin to the point of fragility, with haunted eyes that Marcus recognized all too well. "Mr. Cole?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Evelyn. I was at the facility. The training center, I mean. 6 months ago." Marcus nodded, struggling to place her face among the hundreds of veterans who had passed through the program. "I came there because I was going to kill myself," Evelyn continued, the words tumbling out as if she'd been rehearsing them for weeks. "I had my method picked out, my note written, everything planned. I just wanted one last shot at feeling useful first. So I signed up for the electrical program, thinking I'd learn something before I—" She trailed off, tears spilling down her cheeks. Marcus reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "You're still here." Evelyn nodded, wiping at her face. "I'm still here because of you, because of the program, because of the people there, because for the first time since I got back from deployment, someone looked at me and saw a person instead of a problem." She took a shaky breath. "I got a job last month. Electrical work, just like they taught me. My own apartment. I'm even dating someone, which I never thought I'd do again." She squeezed his hand. "You saved my life, Mr. Cole. I just wanted you to know that." Marcus pulled her into a hug, feeling her thin body shake with sobs against his chest. He thought of all the nights he'd spent staring at the ceiling of his truck, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply drove off a bridge. He thought of the darkness that had once seemed so absolute, so inescapable. "You saved yourself," he said softly. "I just helped you find the way." The foundation grew faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 years of opening, it had chapters in 12 states, serving over 3,000 veterans annually. Donations poured in from across the country, supplementing Marcus's initial investment and ensuring the organization's long-term sustainability. But Marcus was careful to keep the focus where it belonged. He declined most media requests, redirected praise to his team and the veterans they served, and insisted that the Foundation's mission remain clear and uncomplicated. They were there to help. Everything else was secondary. He still visited the Montana facility regularly, walking the grounds where his life had changed, standing in the workshop where veterans learned the skills that would rebuild their futures. The entrance to the underground complex had been permanently sealed, its secrets now preserved in museums and archives, but Marcus sometimes stood above it, remembering the night he'd first descended those stone steps into darkness. He thought about Colonel Price, the man who had hidden the vault and left the letter that started everything. He thought about the courage it must have taken to defy orders, to risk everything for the slim chance that someday someone would find what he'd protected. "You did it," Marcus whispered to the empty air. You got your second chance. We both did. On the 3rd anniversary of the Foundation's opening, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was in his office reviewing program reports when the receptionist buzzed him with news that a woman was asking to see him. She wouldn't give her name, only said that she was there about Colonel Price. Marcus hesitated, old instincts flaring to life. The conspiracy had been exposed, the perpetrators prosecuted, but that didn't mean all the shadows had been chased away. Still, his curiosity outweighed his caution. He told the receptionist to send her in. The woman who entered was perhaps 60 years old, elegant in a way that suggested old money and careful upbringing. But there was something in her eyes, a weight, a sorrow, that didn't match her refined appearance. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Margaret Price. Raymond Price was my father." Marcus rose slowly, his mind spinning. "Colonel Price, you're his daughter." "I am." She sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap. "I've debated coming here for a long time. Part of me wanted to thank you for what you did. Part of me wanted to apologize for what my father's actions put you through." "Your father didn't put me through anything," Marcus said. "He tried to do the right thing. He left that letter because he believed someone would eventually find it and have the courage to act." Margaret's eyes glistened. "He talked about you, you know, not by name, obviously, but he talked about the person who would someday open that vault. He said they would be someone special, someone who understood that some things matter more than personal gain." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small box. "He wanted this to be given to whoever found it. He left instructions with his lawyer, sealed documents that weren't supposed to be opened until the vault was discovered. I've been holding on to this since your story first broke." Marcus took the box, feeling its weight in his palm. Inside, resting on a bed of worn velvet, was a military medal, a silver star, its ribbon faded with age. "He earned that in Korea," Margaret said. "Saved his entire platoon from an ambush. He always said it was the proudest moment of his life, until the day he refused to move that money." She paused. "He wanted you to have it. He said whoever found what he'd hidden would understand what it meant to put others above yourself." Marcus stared at the medal, feeling the significance of the moment pressed down on him. Colonel Price had never met him, had died decades before Marcus was even born. And yet, across the gulf of time, the man had reached out and touched his life in a way that would resonate forever. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll treasure it." Margaret smiled, the expression bittersweet. "He would be proud of what you've built here, the foundation, the training programs, all of it. He spent his whole life trying to serve his country the right way. You've done what he always wanted to do. You've turned secrets and shadows into something that helps people." She rose to leave, but paused at the door. "Mr. Cole, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Was it worth it? All the danger, the fear, the uncertainty, was finding what you found worth everything you went through?" Marcus thought about the question carefully. He thought about the assault, the threats, the nights spent wondering if he would survive until morning. He thought about Thomas, about the price his friend had paid for standing with him. He thought about the $275 million that had once seemed like an impossible fortune and had transformed into something far more valuable. "Yes," he said finally, "not because of the money, but because of what the money let me build. Every veteran who comes through these doors, every life that gets a second chance, that's what makes it worth it. That's what gives meaning to everything that came before." Margaret nodded slowly. "My father would have said the same thing." She left without another word, and Marcus sat alone in his office, holding the silver star, feeling the weight of legacy and purpose pressing gently against his heart. The years that followed brought continued growth, new challenges, and moments of profound meaning. The Foundation expanded its programs, added facilities in new states, and developed partnerships with corporations and government agencies that amplified its impact. Marcus stepped back from day-to-day operations, trusting his team to carry the mission forward while he focused on the strategic vision. He became a speaker, an advocate, a face for the cause of veterans' rights. He testified before Congress, appeared on news programs, and wrote articles that reached millions of readers. But he never forgot where he came from. Every year, on the anniversary of his discovery, he returned to the original facility in Montana. He walked the grounds alone, stood in the workshop, visited the cemetery where Thomas was buried. On the 10th anniversary, he stood before a crowd of over 2,000 at a ceremony dedicating a new wing of the training center. The wing would be named after Thomas, a permanent tribute to the man who had taught Marcus that intelligence was about understanding, not just gathering information. Behind him, a banner proclaimed the Foundation's impact. Over 50,000 veterans served, over 20,000 jobs placed, over 5,000 lives saved from homelessness. The numbers were staggering, but they were just numbers. What mattered was the faces behind them, the stories, the transformations. Marcus stepped to the microphone, the Montana wind tugging at his suit jacket. The crowd fell silent. 10 years ago, he began, I was a man with nothing. No home, no hope, no future. I thought my story was over. I thought the country I'd served had forgotten me, and maybe I deserved to be forgotten. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, veterans, donors, staff members, families who had been touched by the Foundation's work. I was wrong. Not because I found a fortune buried in the ground, not because I became famous or successful by conventional measures. I was wrong because I didn't understand what really matters. What matters isn't what you have, it's what you do with what you have. What matters isn't the size of your bank account, it's the size of your heart. He gestured towards the building behind him. This place exists because one man, Colonel Raymond Price, decided that some things are more important than following orders. It exists because a handful of forgotten veterans decided to stand together instead of standing alone. And it exists because of you, all of you, who believed that the people who serve this country deserve to be served in return. His voice grew stronger. We're not done. There are still veterans sleeping under bridges tonight. There are still warriors coming home to a system that doesn't know how to help them. There are still broken bodies and wounded souls being told that they're not worth saving. He shook his head. That stops with us. Every veteran who walks through our doors deserves to know that their sacrifice mattered, that their life matters, that they are not forgotten. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. I want to end with a story, he said, raising his hand for quiet. 3 years ago, a young woman named Evelyn came to this facility. She was planning to end her life. She signed up for our electrical program as a last attempt to feel useful before she was gone. He paused. Today, Evelyn is a master electrician with her own business. She employs 4 other veterans. She's engaged to be married, and next month she's going to have a baby. He smiled, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. That's what this is about. Not the buildings or the programs or the money. It's about giving people back their lives. It's about proving that broken things can still be made whole. He looked up at the sky, cloudless and vast, the Montana sun warming his face. To everyone who has served, to everyone who has struggled, and to everyone who has found the courage to believe that tomorrow can be better than today. Thank you for being part of this journey. We're just getting started. The applause rolled over him like thunder, and Marcus stood there, letting it wash away the last remnants of the pain and fear and loneliness that had once defined his existence. He thought of the night he'd first descended into that underground facility, the terror and wonder of discovering what lay beneath. He thought of the battles that followed, the losses and victories, the moments of despair and triumph. And he thought of the man he used to be, the broken veteran sleeping in his truck, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply disappeared. That man seemed like a stranger now, a ghost from another life. In his place stood someone new, someone forged in fire and tempered by purpose. Marcus Cole had found a fortune buried in the ground, but the real treasure, the one that mattered, was the life he'd built on top of it. A life of service, of meaning, of connection. A life that proved, once and for all, that no one is truly forgotten as long as someone remembers to look for them. Anyone can rebuild what seems beyond repair if they're willing to dig deep enough and believe that what's buried isn't always meant to stay hidden. As the Montana sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the Foundation's campus, Marcus Cole walked among the veterans who had come to find a second chance. He shook hands, shared stories, listened to struggles and celebrated victories. He was no longer the homeless man who had paid $2,400 for 200 acres of supposed worthless land. He was the founder of a movement, the voice of the voiceless, the living proof that broken things could be made whole again. Because for Marcus and for the thousands who now followed in his footsteps, the underground vault hadn't just contained money. It had contained possibility, and possibility, once released into the world, could never be buried again. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances are waiting for you. Click to keep watching with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe forgotten heroes still deserve to be found.